Ovo su ideje u kojima danas ponovno razgovaramo o Sjedinjenim Američkim Državama u kontekstu ovaj put onoga što se događa na unutarnjem planu. Prije svega govorimo o drami u Minnesoti gdje su agenti ICE-a do ovog trenutka, nažalost, ubili dvoje nevinih ljudi. Naša gošća bit će profesorica Fionnuala Ní Aoláin, inače predavačica ljudskih prava na Pravnom fakultetu Sveučilišta Minnesota.
You have men with guns, large guns. They are masked. They are not identified. They do not drive cars that we can identify. Yesterday, I think it was minus 27 degrees. People who stand to protest in this kind of weather are pretty tough people. The lesson is about resistance and organizing and solidarity and communities coming together across religious lines and racial lines.
Na samom početku podsjećam vas, pretplatite se na naše Spotify, YouTube kanale, tako ćete nas pronaći najbrže i najjednostavnije. Odlazimo sada uživo u Minnesotu, s nama je profesorica Fionnuala Ní Aoláin. Good afternoon, welcome to our program.
Glad to be here.
Unfortunately, we'll have to talk about pretty difficult situation in Minnesota. If you can describe us, how does it look today?
Well, today is somewhat improved from recent days. It's been a very difficult couple of weeks for the state of Minnesota, and the federal government, led by, of course, the president, but also the offices of enforcement of Homeland Security and the Border Patrol, made a decision to employ a massive number, almost, we believe, 3,000 ICE agents. ICE is a federal security agency responsible for the enforcement on immigration, and decided to deploy this very, very large number of security personnel to the state. And it's worth noting, of course, that Minnesota has one of the smallest numbers of immigrants in the entire United States. It's a very cold place. It's in the northern part of the United States. So it's not sunny and warm. So it's not a place where lots of people come. And so this large deployment of federal agents has been on the streets. They've been armed. They've been masked. They have, as we know, killed 2 US citizens in the last couple of weeks. And they've been engaged in a systematic campaign of intimidation and violence against citizens and non-citizens alike.
Do you think that after described like this ICE operation in Minnesota has something to do with illegal migrants, or is it actually a political message and political operation run by White House, by Trump associates like Miller?
So if we were really, there's an appropriate place for immigration control. Every country has immigration control, and that's a lawful and reasonable thing for a country to do. But if you are really interested in migration control, you deploy your forces in cooperation with local police, in cooperation with local communities, in cooperation with law enforcement in the area. And one of the most notable things we see in Minnesota and in other states is that lack of cooperation, where local law enforcement, local police are saying, this is not helping us. This isn't making us safer. This isn't about immigration enforcement. This is about something else. And of course, the something else is exactly as you alluded to. The state of Minnesota has a governor who ran on the ticket of Kamala Harris against the president. Much of the politics of this administration is very petty. It's very personal. And so most observers would say that the goal of this policy is in fact a politics of revenge on the state of Minnesota, and specifically in part aimed at the governor and the perceived Democratic party in the state of Minnesota.
What the Trump administration was planning to do in Minnesota? Did they hope maybe to, how to say, squeeze opposition? Do you think that maybe they wanted some kind of chaos?
Well, I think the purpose is fear and the purpose is chaos. Because if you wanted efficient law enforcement, you wouldn't do it this way. You would do it a different way. And I think it's less about squeezing a political opposition, but actually about communicating something to ordinary Americans. It's about communicating that you can have an armed force on your streets. And again, images of Minnesota have been seen across the world where you have men with guns, large guns. They are masked. They are not identified. They do not drive cars that we can identify. They don't make themselves known. Generally, if a policeman comes to your house, whether it's in Minnesota or in Europe, they say who they are. You can see a number. You know who you're dealing with. The point here is to do something different. It's to instill fear. And the fear is in part because ordinary Minnesotans, one of the extraordinary things about the last couple of weeks is that ordinary Minnesotans have said, we don't accept the government can behave this way. Democracies don't have masked, unidentified people patrolling their streets and pulling people into cars, breaking windows, ramming into houses without legal warrants of arrest. We don't accept this. And the more Minnesotans didn't accept the behavior on their streets, the more the federal government and President Trump pushed back.
But first, did you expect this kind of reaction from the public? Because in general situations, ordinary citizens are not so reluctant to engage themselves in a fight against government. So did you expect it? And do you think that Trump expected this kind of reaction?
I don't think the president expected this reaction. And we already today see a climb down. They're now climbing back from what's been happening over the last couple of weeks. The president has taken the head of ICE out of Minnesota. He's committed to reducing the numbers of troops on the streets of Minnesota. He has also changed the person in charge. So a new person, the border czar, is now in charge of the enforcement operation. So I
Do you
don't
think that
think
he's a better solution?
so I think he's a different solution. The border czar is notably far less rhetorical and adversarial than Kristi Noem, the previous government official in charge. He's been known for stressing that the people he wants to deport are violent criminals, not law-abiding people, and certainly not Americans. He is a much more considered and thoughtful person. So yes, this is certainly a change of leadership and tempo. Now, will it change day-to-day life in Minnesota? Hard to know, but I think what was underestimated, you don't live, Minnesota is a very cold place. It's yesterday, I think it was minus 27 degrees. People who stand to protest in this kind of weather are pretty tough people. These are people who are not afraid of standing in the freezing Arctic cold and telling the government that they're overstepping. Minnesota is also a very neighborly state. It's in many ways the very best of America. It's a place where neighbors look after neighbors. It's a place where there are deep bonds in the community. And it's also a state that has historically been incredibly welcoming to new Americans and to migrants. And so when you step on a state like Minnesota, I think that they fundamentally underestimated the character of the state, the social resilience of the state, and actually how tough people are and how prepared they were to stand out in the freezing cold, to take risks, and to defend their neighbors.
I have to ask you, maybe you saw them personally. Who are those ICE people? How would you describe them? And what do you think is real purpose in Trump scenario for United States?
Yeah, I have seen them. I've seen them close to my home, and I've seen them in my neighborhood, and I've seen them on the streets. I think it's quite shocking. I'm a human rights law professor, and I have traveled to many countries where we've had extreme repression, where you have no identification, but you don't associate democracies with this kind of third force. So when you see people on your streets who are wearing visor glasses, whose faces are covered, who are carrying heavy machinery, who are also carrying the kind of objects that are less lethal but really dangerous. For example, irritants and spray to use against people who have a right to protest under the US Constitution. There's a right to free expression in the United States. This is, I mean, I think it's shocking for many Americans, for Europeans like myself who live in America. It's profoundly shocking to see these people on your streets. And I think it's that shock, that sense that this isn't something happening far away, but it's happening for ordinary people, and they don't accept it. They see it as abnormal. This is partly what's happened in the last 2 weeks to President Trump, that ordinary Americans, not just left-wing Americans or Americans who are going to be in the Democratic Party, but ordinary Americans saw these images, and they saw ordinary people like them on the streets of Minnesota being badly treated by their government. And that made them, I think, ordinary Americans, and we see this in the president's polling, deeply unpopular, deeply concerned. And this is why we've had a change of tactic by the administration.
I have to ask you a question which is very not nice, how to put it. But are you afraid of midterm elections and what can happen around them when you see what this administration is ready to do?
Well, I think those of us lawyers who think about democracy, when we see the use of force like this, we become concerned for the integrity of democracy. And of course, the most sacred thing for a democracy is elections. And a big question for November is, will we have free and fair elections in the United States? Will people be able to go to the polls? Will we have ICE agents or Border Patrol agents on our streets discouraging people from going to the polls? Will Black and brown people feel safe outside of their homes going to vote? And I think the answer is we don't know. This is new territory for the United States. For observers of the United States, it's impossible to imagine what we see. But I do have hope. We have very robust courts. And one of the things we've seen is that the courts have been extremely active in addressing the excesses of overreach of power by this administration. So I think the hope lies in the fact that ordinary citizens, when you look at the polling, it doesn't matter if they're Democratic or if they're Republican, they want an election. They want a fair election. They don't actually, the polling suggests that past the sort of core of Donald Trump's base, ordinary Americans, it doesn't matter whether they're red or blue, they don't like this kind of violence on their streets. And I think ordinary Americans are going to want an election. So let's hope that ordinary Americans win.
Talking about courts, there is one court which is acting a little bit different than all other courts. I'm talking about Supreme Court. So what do you expect from them? Do you think they have a point? I'm talking about conservative majority. Do you have that conservative majority in Supreme Court has a point after which they will say to Trump, enough?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, and so we don't know what the court will decide. But we've certainly seen the court be quite skeptical of some things that this administration has done. It seems to be, we're waiting for decisions, but just listening to the oral arguments in the court, they seem to be very, very concerned that Donald Trump's tariffs are illegal. They appear to be very concerned that meddling, for example, with the financial structures of the United States through the Fed is also not consistent with the state. And what we've also seen is the court really try to avoid a head-on clash with this administration. So making decisions that are often on finer technical points rather than a wholesale endorsement of the president's agenda, current political agenda, especially around issues like search and seizure, on issues like the deployment of the federal guard, the federal forces to states. So the answer is we don't know, but we do know some things. The United States has a very strong constitutional tradition of states' rights, of the right of states to enforce the criminal law, to order their own affairs. And so even it seems to me that a conservative majority on the court is not going to rewrite the Constitution. So I'm not saying, we can overstate it's certainly a conservative court. It's very conservative on social issues like abortion, for example. But it's also, I think, conservative and cautious in that the court's own legitimacy matters to this court too. So I'm not predicting that we who are concerned about the rule of law and the current stance of the administration will win every case at the court, but I think we're going to win some cases at the court, and those cases will really matter.
And what about Congress? Did you expect a little bit more stronger position of a Republican majority in Congress?
Well, the congressional majority needs to look at the Constitution and remember that there are separate spheres of government, and Congress has a role to play in the oversight and accountability for the administration. But we're starting also to see some changes there. We see many, many Republicans and Democrats, but particularly Republicans, were very uncomfortable with the last 2 weeks of military action in the state of Minnesota. We've seen that publicly, the way some of them have been tweeting, but we've also seen, we understand privately that they're having conversations with the president and his advisors. This kind of politics isn't good for Republicans. This kind of politics might not elect Republicans to Congress in November. So I think many, elected officials have short-term visions. They want to get reelected. We have an election in November. This president is unpopular in many, many respects. And so where do I think we are going to see greater congressional sort of robustness? We will see it when Republicans remember that they too have to be reelected. And we're starting to see a little bit of that already.
Your professional focus are human rights. Are you afraid for the perspective of human rights in the United States, considering Minnesota situation and in general Trump moves? Or maybe do you hope that it will, in a way, wake up people?
Look, the United States has long had a very clear double standard on human rights. It has preached human rights overseas when it suits it, but it has not always consistently enforced human rights at home, whether we think back to the era of segregation, which is really not that long ago in the United States, and when we think about fundamental civil rights, for example, equality rights, we've had a long and profound struggle in the United States for these things. So no one should ever see the US as a kind of paragon of virtue on human rights. But the current US position is not just worrying at home. When you use the kinds of tactics that we see on the streets of Minnesota or now in Maine, the administration has a new state in its sights, we're sending signals to authoritarian governments, actually, that it's okay to do these things to protesters, that it's okay to use force against protesters, that it's okay to arbitrarily detain people without due process. So I worry about the US, but I also worry about the global signal that we are sending to highly repressive states, that actually these norms are pick and choose, that democracies sometimes enforce them and sometimes don't. And I think that is really dangerous. The United States may recover, but actually the rule of law globally, I think, will take a long time to sort of undo this double standard problem that is being sort of propagated by the Trump administration's. You can preach to Iran about what you're doing to protesters, and then in the same frame, we are seeing the kind of violence that we're seeing in the US. So this is a double standard, and everybody sees a double standard.
Talking about international message, you worked for years for United Nations Human Rights Council. I have to ask you, what do you think about this alternative United Nations, which Trump tried to launch in Davos?
I think I think those of us within the system understand that this is not an alternative. This is it's like a Trump gold card. This is a paid membership where people get brought in and thrown out at the will of the dictator. We saw Mark Carney's treatment this week when he had the audacity to give a speech that was profoundly popular and very thoughtful, and a day later, he's no longer invited to the club. I think no observer thinks this club is a substitute for anything. It's a plaything of a leader who's increasingly viewed as having tendencies that are authoritarian. We're a cult of personality, a man who needs trophies, a man who wants somebody else's Nobel Prize. This is not a serious game. He's 80 years old. This cult of personality won't last forever. The UN has been around a lot longer than the cult of personality that is Donald Trump, and will survive him.
So you're not afraid for United Nations, no matter all problems and pressures under which that organization is?
There's no doubt. I think it's clear the UN and the UN80 process is clear. The United Nations is in a profound financial crisis. We have a crisis of multilateralism in some ways. But I would also say I think that crisis is sort of overblown by the media. The day-to-day work of the UN goes on, and lots of that work is not sexy. It's not about the use of force. So a couple of weeks ago, we had a major biodiversity treaty signed. It included every state but the United States. It's a really good treaty. It may do something to address global warming, particularly in our oceans. That's not going to make the front pages of any newspaper, but it still speaks to the reality that states are making deals with one another. And we see the same in UNICEF, in the child rights area, where the work goes on in multiple zones, even with this noise by Donald Trump. And we see it in a whole range of organizations. So I think it's not to undermine the fact that we have a crisis, and we certainly have an institutional crisis and a financial crisis. But I think sometimes it's easy to focus on the crisis and not to focus on the kind of more boring, routine, regular work that states want an international organization to do because it's efficient, because they have invested in it already, and actually because it serves their interests. So both of these things can be true at the same time. You can have a challenge for an organization. There's lots of challenges for the UN, but you can also have the daily work of the UN going on behind those headlines that say it's not working, because states in lots and lots of not so sexy areas, whether it's the law of the sea, whether it's in the area of environmental protection, whether it's on the prevention of the spread of chemical weapons, these are things that states want to do. And this rather silly board of peace with this entrance fee is never going to replace that kind of work. And nor, I think, do any of the leaders who are paying an entry fee expect it to.
I have to go a little bit back to the daily life and to average American. How much of these messages reached Americans? This international reaction on Trump ideas, at least attempts to defend multilateralism and so on?
So most America is a continent. It's not a country. It's huge. Many Americans don't have passports. They don't travel outside of the United States. In many ways, they are a very an insular state, unlike, let's say, Europeans who travel all the time, who know who their neighbors are, who speak multiple languages, who have a sense of a bigger world that affects them than I think many average Americans do. For many average Americans, the news will be what happened in the state next to you, not the country next to you. So it's a difference of perspective, a less maybe global perspective for average Americans. But I think many Americans do care about their image abroad. So, for example, while Trump has been threatening to take over Greenland, again, another kind of uh, quite challenging set of behaviors by a leader who is, in theory, leading a country who's part of the NATO alliance. I think, again, when we see the polling on Greenland, we see many, including in Trump's base, saying, well, why are you engaging in this kind of rhetoric, and why are you spending your energies overseas, and why do you want these things? So there's this peripheral, I think, way in which that information is filtering down to ordinary Americans. But actually, more than anything else, ordinary Americans also care about their pocketbooks. And it turns out that life is expensive in the US right now. When you tariff things, everything costs more.
Do you think
When
do you
you
think that average American can see results of tariffs in his daily life
I don't think
already?
not every average American is going to make the link between the tariff and the thing that costs more. But I think we know from the polling, and there was a recent New York Times Siena poll looking exactly at this question of economic perceptions of America. Many Americans feel that economically life is not good in the US right now. So I think even if it's the cause and effect gap is missing, actually the sense that things are not going well tells you something about how they feel about the administration.
What do you hope that the result of this January in Minnesota will be for United States? And what are you afraid of as a result of Minnesota January?
Actually, I think what comes out of Minnesota is really powerful. Nothing to be afraid of. It shows many, many things. One, it shows that it's not just about the protests that you saw, but actually what really defined Minnesota in the last several weeks has been the degree of organization and work done by people to support other people. So picking kids up and sending them to school, looking after your neighbors, organizing for people to go to work, driving people. There's a whole system in place which has emerged in recent weeks, which shows you that people, it's not just about standing on a street and shouting that they're against the government. It's about doing really practical things to make life better for your neighbor.
Just to explain to our viewers, you're talking about a system in which citizens help to their neighbors to avoid ICE if they could be targeted by ICE.
Right, exactly. And we've seen it a massive surge in volunteering, in support for communities, and this kind of mobilization, I think, is enormously powerful. So I actually take from the last couple of weeks, you can walk away and look at the violence, and there's been two people have lost their lives in circumstances that appear to be summary and arbitrary executions. And that is profound, and no one should forget it. But I actually think the lesson is about resistance and organizing and solidarity and communities coming together across religious lines and racial lines and living lines. And that is a far more, and that's consistent with the kind of state that Minnesota is. It's the middle of America. It's not blue, it's not red, it's purple. And that quality of response tells you something that I think is far more profound than the violence that we see. The violence that we see from ICE is predictable for a badly recruited, badly trained, overindulged force. But what you see in human response, I think, is far more powerful than what you see in the violence of ICE, which is not unexpected. But the way people respond, that's really unexpected.
Professor Ní Aoláin, thank you very much for your time. We are hoping to get better or great news from Minnesota as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hvala i vama, dragi gledatelji. Bile su ovo Ideje HR.